Have you heard all the stories on the news lately about cold cases being solved by forensic genealogy? Are you fascinated by unsolved mysteries that you wish could be answered? Are you intrigued by DNA technology and its application to cold murder cases? Or do you just love a good story with a satisfying ending? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then I have the podcast for you. DNA ID is the only true crime podcast dedicated exclusively to cold cases solved by forensic genealogy. On my show, you'll get all the behind-the-scenes details on how these cases were brought to closure and how the victims finally got justice. Listen to DNA ID Season 3 starting January 16th, 2023, wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Scene of the Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking.
Hey everyone, it's Mike Morford here. It's been a while since we put out an episode of Zodiac Speaking. We had a good response to the last episode, so I thought I'd fly solo here for another episode. And this time around, I think we've got another great conversation that listeners will be interested in. The state of DNA evidence in the Zodiac case, and can it help to close this case once and for all? Think about it. How much do we really know about all of the potential DNA evidence in the Zodiac case? Not to mention other cases that may be connected to Zodiac. Have you ever listened to a podcast, watched a TV show, or read a book that was all about the Zodiac case DNA and what that DNA can maybe do for the case? I know I haven't, because I don't think there's been anything solely focused on DNA in this case. And we have lots of potential DNA evidence in the Zodiac case. All of the letters and envelopes Zodiac handled and mailed, shell casings from crime scenes, and even bindings that he handled. All of these things potentially have the power to provide answers in this case, once and for all. But to really dive into the DNA possibilities, I knew that I needed an expert who could bring knowledge and insights to the conversation that would help listeners understand the facts. So I sat down with Susanna Ryan, lab director of Pure Gold Forensics. She's a forensic DNA analyst with almost 25 years of experience, and she's worked on not one, but two cases that might be connected to Zodiac. I think listeners will really learn a lot from my discussion with Susanna. I know I did. So sit back and enjoy this episode. And hopefully you learned something from this episode that you didn't know before, like I did. Thank you so much, Susanna, for coming on the show and discussing the Zodiac case with us. It's very, very interesting in that I don't think there's been a long, in-depth discussion about this case and what DNA clues there may not be, what might be able to be done to solve this case. And I think your insights are going to be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to talk about any of the DNA related evidence with whatever information I can provide. I'm happy to do that. So I think there's a plethora of potential DNA evidence in this case.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of stuff, supposedly has been done, but maybe not done recently. And a lot of questions. But I think you hit the nail on the head. There's probably a lot of potential for DNA. So before we get started, can you just tell listeners a little bit about your background, who you are, what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Susanna Ryan, and I'm a forensic DNA analyst and lab director at it's called Pure Gold Forensics. We're a private accredited forensic DNA laboratory. But I've been in the field of forensic DNA since 1999 is when I got my first job. So I've been doing DNA testing since 99. I'm also a DNA consultant, so I review other analysts' work and consult with attorneys on, what the DNA evidence means or does not mean. And yeah, I've worked at a number of different public and private labs since 99.
And in full disclosure, you're not a stranger to the Zodiac case or to Zodiac adjacent cases. Can you give us a little rundown
Mhm.
of what you've done in connection to some of these cases that might be connected to the Zodiac case?
Yeah, so there's two cases that are considered possible Zodiac cases. I mean, certainly there are arguments both for and against. People think that they are related, people think that they are not related. So one would be the Sherry Jo Bates case. So that one, I was able to do MVAC collection on a couple of different items associated with that case. And the other case would be the Ray Davis case, which was from Oceanside, California. And again, I did a little bit of MVAC collection for that particular case.
That's awesome, and we're definitely going to talk about those cases. But I guess to get started, obviously we're talking about a case that the confirmed murders are 1968, 1969. The possible murders go back to the early 60s. And then we have letters that were mailed, some letters that we know came from Zodiac were mailed in the 60s and 70s. And, some of them that may have come from Zodiac were mailed even into the 1990s. But either way, we're talking about 30 years or more in far as, age. What are maybe some of the limitations and expectations when you're looking at potential DNA evidence that is that old?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to consider is just DNA degradation or breakdown over time, so it's definitely going to be dependent upon how the evidence was stored. So, I have worked on cases from the 60s, for example, where we've gotten beautiful results, no evidence of degradation whatsoever. So if items are stored properly, which typically means at least in a temperature controlled environment where it's not being exposed to heat, and better yet, if the items are stored in the cold, frozen or refrigerated, that's going to be best. So that's always something to factor in when you have, a cold case. You have evidence from a case that's many decades old, is you have to be concerned about degradation. And then the other concern that comes into play with those types of cases are those that the handling was different, right? We didn't know about DNA testing in the years that some of these cases are coming from. So we don't know how they're handled. We don't know if a person was wearing gloves or not. Have the items gone through other forensic testing where, like a firearms examiner, they weren't really wearing gloves until probably the late 2000s. So we or like 2000, let's see, 2000. I remember working at FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, in 2002 to 2005. And it was around that time frame that we had to start telling our firearms examiners, please wear gloves, please change your gloves. So it's, you can't expect someone from 70s, 80s, 90s to be wearing gloves when they're examining evidence that they're not thinking about, oh, we can get touch DNA from these items. So that's the other major concern is contamination.
Yeah, and obviously they didn't know about DNA at the time that these crimes happened. And there's pictures of the Zodiac case of some of the investigators holding a piece of the victim's shirt up with their bare hands. Right. So there's obviously a potential for that. So in this case, over the years, there has been some work with DNA. It's been not fully detailed of what it is, to what extent it's been done. It's sort of under wraps, but if something was tested in this case, let's say touch DNA, and I happen to know, one of the cases we're going to touch on here, there was touch DNA done. I'm guessing it was 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, even. Is there something there that could have been missed at that time that could be available now? Because listeners, I think, need to understand that every few years DNA processing and science jumps in leaps and bounds. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it is possible that even if something was tested 7 or 8 years ago, there is a potential for increased results or better results, more results today. Kind of twofold. One is the instrumentation we're using is more sensitive, and to detect the DNA. And also the chemicals that are used to amplify or copy the DNA are, again, more sensitive. We can get results with much less DNA, even from 7 or 8 years ago. And the manufacturers of these chemicals or reagents, they have better formulations to kind of overcome some of the things that would have affected the results. We call them inhibitors. So it's something that can kind of slow down the amplification or copying process. So the newer kits are more sensitive and can overcome some of those inhibitors. And then, of course, if you're talking about, let's say, a larger item or just in terms of collection, we think about, in the past, it was mostly just swabbing or cutting out a sample. And of course, now, we can AbJack, we can use the AbJack on items like if you had a clothing item that you think that the perpetrator touched, we can, instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to swab this area because this seems likely that the person touched here. If we don't know, if we don't really have a very good guess as to where an item was contacted, then we can use an AbJack and collect from a much larger area than a swab would allow us to do. So, we've got the increased sensitivity in just the processing, and then better collection methods. So that's why it might be possible today to get results from something that even a few years ago we weren't getting results from.
And along those lines, advancements in the science and what can be done and what can't be done, there's been rootless hairs can even produce DNA profiles and clues there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So in the past, we could get results from rootless hairs, but that was with mitochondrial DNA testing. And so mitochondrial DNA testing has its limitations in the fact that all maternal relatives are going to have the same mitochondrial profile. So even if you got a result, you wouldn't be, and a person was included, you can't say, oh, it's definitely them. You could say it might be this person, it might be anyone on their maternal line, or it could be a coincidental match, someone that's distantly related or just by coincidence has the same mitochondrial profile. So that was, the limitations in the past. Now today, mitochondrial DNA is still being used, and it can be really good, for example, for exclusionary purposes, right? Because if the profile doesn't match your person of interest, then that's 100% like, oh, okay, this is not a hair, he could not have contributed this hair. But today what we have is there's only one lab I know of that is using this technique, Estrella Forensics, which is Professor Ed Green's lab out of Santa Cruz, California. He is doing testing, SNP testing. So that SNP is short nucleotide polymorphisms. And that's the exact type of testing that is used in like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. Like if you get your DNA tested, you spit into a tube and send it off to one of those companies, they're doing SNP testing. And that's also the type of profile that can be uploaded to GEDmatch, which is the publicly available database that, police are now able to search. And that's how the Golden State Killer was identified, through his relatives that were in GEDmatch. So with this rootless hair testing, that's what they're able to do. They're able to get this profile that can be used for genealogical searching purposes.
I mean, that just seems like such a huge game changer that can be done now because, obviously if you're talking something that's rich in DNA, like semen or something along those lines, where you have like a rape that occurred, that's one thing, but to get just a hair that could have fallen off somebody's head, and at the crime scene, and you pick that up, that could lead to the identity of the person is just pretty amazing. Is that something that's going to be more mainline going forward? You mentioned only one place does that now, but is that something you see really taking off?
Well, potentially, yes, but we also have to be aware that people are constantly losing hairs, right? So just because you find a hair at a crime scene does not mean that person had anything to do with the crime or was ever even there, right? So there are some caveats to the hair testing, in that you have to be pretty confident that hair is associated with the crime. Now, if you find hairs clasped in a victim's hand, okay, probably associated with the crime, right? If you just have like some kind of vacuum sweepings or something like that of the room where the victim was found, who knows if it's associated with the crime? So
Sure.
I do think it is useful. I think it would be great if there were more labs that were doing it, because obviously this lab is going to be pretty overwhelmed pretty soon if, once people start realizing and understanding the capabilities. There have been several cases that I've worked on that hairs have been sent to this laboratory. They're getting great results. Not every hair is going to yield a result. They do need, a certain length of hair. And sometimes, even though they're looking already at very degraded DNA, because that's what's in the shaft of the hair, is just, there is DNA. We always thought, there is no DNA in the shaft of the hair. It turns out there is, but it's very, very broken down and degraded to the point that that's why they have to do the SNP testing. So it can be very useful. And I do see it being used in cold cases for sure. Again, I just think that we have to make sure that we're testing hairs that are definitely associated with the crime.
Yeah. And it's at least maybe a good starting point. If you find a hair, perhaps that is the right person, and maybe if it's something, for example, that comes in the form of a letter that Zodiac mailed and it's inside the envelope, maybe that's a little bit more interesting than just finding a hair, attached to a victim's body. And so along those lines, Arthur Lee Allen, the biggest Zodiac suspect, well-known one, was ruled out because a hair found underneath a stamp on the outside of an envelope did not match him. He was ruled out with that. But then again, the hair is on the outside of the envelope under a stamp. Maybe it belonged to the mailman. Maybe it belonged to anybody along the mail system. But it was interesting that hair, and I'm going back years now, that hair ruled him out. I'm wondering if that hair's still in evidence someplace, if it could potentially be tested to get a profile, and then genealogy done.
Yeah. So if it still existed, yes. But based upon the photo that I've seen that you sent me of that hair, I would guess that the entire sample probably had to be used for mitochondrial DNA, because usually with mitochondrial DNA, they want about 2 centimeters worth of hair. And that appeared to be, based upon the size of the hair in relation to the size of the stamp, my guess is they probably had to use the entire sample. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe they said, okay, we're only going to use half and let's see what we can get with half. And so if that's the case, then yes, genealogy could be attempted, although they also like to have a little bit more to work with than, about 2 centimeters is usually what they're asking for as well. The other possibility would be if there was DNA extract remaining. I'm not sure if the lab could do any work. Like, let's say the FBI or whomever did the mitochondrial testing did have to use the entire hair. They may have a portion of liquid which would contain the DNA extract, it would be possible. I don't know because I don't know Astrea's protocols, but perhaps they could work with whatever remained in terms of the liquid extract. So that would be another possibility to consider.
That's interesting. And you bring up a good thing that, a lot of people probably don't think about back, whether it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, whenever they were really getting started with DNA, it took a lot more sample up when they did testing versus now. Can you explain in relatively easy to understand terms how you can do more with less in 2023 than you could do back in the early 1990s?
Oh yeah, that's like night and day. I mean, we're talking about the differences between 10 years ago or something like that, but 10 years ago, we were still doing the same basic type of testing. We're doing short tandem repeat testing, which is short sections of DNA found along the DNA molecule that consist of a specific pattern. The pattern will repeat over and over again. So we're not looking at the entire DNA molecule. We're just looking at these little sections of DNA and then making many copies of those little sections of DNA. So prior to STR testing, there was a type of testing called RFLP, which stands for restriction fragment length polymorphism. And with that type of testing, you had to have a lot of DNA and it had to be non-degraded. It could not be broken down at all because the RFLP testing, you use something called a restriction enzyme. And you can think of this as like little molecular scissors that would go in at certain areas and cut the DNA and say, okay, I'm going to cut here. And then I'm going to go way along the DNA molecule, maybe hundreds and hundreds of base pairs and cut again. And that's one of my fragments, but they're really, really long fragments. So if you had DNA that was already broken down, those molecular scissors would be going along trying to cut and they couldn't find the right place because it's already broken down. It's already degraded and broken apart. And so they had to use, blood stains or semen stains, saliva stains, like a blood stain the size of a quarter to get a profile. I could have a blood stain so small I can't even see it with the naked eye. Today we can get results with 5 or 10 cells worth of DNA. So, a blood stain with that size, we're talking about, I don't even know how many hundreds of thousands of cells worth of DNA. So that's the difference, is that we're using much smaller amounts and it can be degraded as long as the portion of DNA that we're trying to copy has not broken down, then we can still get results. And sometimes you can have a profile or you can have a sample that is partially degraded. So some of the bigger pieces of DNA that we try to test might be broken down and you might not get a result there, but you can still probably get results at these smaller locations. And that's another thing that's an advance today, is that the kits, the chemicals that we're using today have incorporated what we call mini STRs. So they're like these whole bunch of little teeny tiny sections of DNA that are the least likely to break down and degrade. So again, we might be able to get results with the 7, 10, 12 mini STR loci, and you don't get results with the other 12, but still that's a good portion of a profile to do comparisons with.
So there was a DNA, I don't know if you'd call it a flow chart or just notes that were released in from the SFPD about suspected Zodiac correspondences and what, if anything, was found in the way of DNA cells. And you've had a chance to look that over. When you read that, what do you see there that's maybe potentially good or not so good?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it looks like, at least the information that I'm looking at, basically it seems like there's no DNA testing listed on this correspondence. It is kind of like what I would call the preliminary analysis. And it appears that this lab is doing something that we probably really wouldn't even bother with today, which is, it looks like they've taken a sample from the various different Zodiac correspondence material and extracted it. So probably either a cutting or a swabbing from the envelope flaps, stamps, things like that. Maybe even just the actual item itself. Like you could swab if somebody just submitted a card or a handwritten letter. I could swab that. And I mean, I have taken, not in the Zodiac case, but swabbed letters, even typed letters. And if a person's hand is brushing on that page while they're writing the letter, I've gotten profiles from that. So it's unclear to me what exactly has been swabbed or sampled from these items. I'm guessing probably the envelope flaps and underneath of the stamps. But what has been done according to this document is sample collected, probably placed in a small tube, liquid added, whether that's water or some sort of extraction buffer, to try to get any of the cellular material into solution. And then a portion of that solution has been added to a microscope slide. And whomever did this analyst looked at a portion under the microscope and determined whether cells were present. So again, that's something that we probably would not, I would not do that today, because in my opinion, that would be sort of wasting sample, right? Because once it's on that microscope slide, you're really not going to use that in the DNA analysis process. And we know that DNA is, so we used to think, like with touch DNA, contact DNA, that the DNA was just in the cells, the nucleus of the cells, right? So if you didn't see a cell, you're not going to get a result. But that's not the case. We know now that you can get DNA from fingerprints, from handprints, even if cellular material, like what we call a nucleated epithelial cell. So basically a skin cell with a nucleus present. Even if you don't see those, you can still get a DNA profile, because there's something called cell-free DNA. And it is basically free-floating DNA that is brought to the surface and comes out through your pores, brought to the surface through sweat or other mechanisms, and is just present on the surface of your skin. So in this case, he's looked at these items for cells, and he's noting, or he or she is noting, cells found, or, few cells. In my opinion, if you're actually seeing cells under a microscope, you've got a really good chance of getting a profile, because I know you can get a profile even if you don't see cells under the microscope.
That's very, very interesting. So basically, in layman's terms, the seeing cells means that the Zodiac, most likely, assuming these are his cells, he shed DNA on these samples that were looked at, in other words.
Someone did, right?
There's
cellular material, so I don't know whose it is, but that tells me that it's likely that, especially in this case, that it's probably there's a good chance it's from saliva, right? So if you're seeing cells, because there's lots of epithelial cells in your saliva. And so that's always one thing we have to think about when we're talking about under, stamps or envelope flaps. Did someone use water or sponge and water, for example, to wet the envelopes, or did they lick the envelope flap? And so since there are cells that are being observed, that indicates more likely than not, that there was actually saliva present. So today, if those samples, those items still existed, I think that you would have a good chance of getting DNA results, assuming they were stored properly.
Now, to see all of these that seem to have cells found, it just seems like there's it seems like a higher chance. It's not like they say, I'll say no cells found or something. A lot of cells seem to have been found. So assume they're from the Zodiac and they are saved properly. It seems like, as you mentioned, a profile could be generated from these. So what might be taking so long? Just again, without having any insight into what they're doing, why are we not getting an answer to this case?
I mean, that's hard for me to answer because I don't know. It's possible these items have been tested, but they were tested too long ago where they didn't have a very good chance of getting a result. So if these were tested in 2000, 2010, I don't know if you would have gotten a profile. You may have maybe a partial profile, maybe not enough to do any CODIS searching, for example, or something like that. It could be that, it's just a cold cases get kicked to the back. And now I know this is a super high profile cold case, but when you're working in a lab that is a government run lab, and I have worked in government run labs, the cold cases stay cold because the new cases, the hot cases are coming in that have to be worked right away. This person is on the street. We need to find out who it is, so those are getting priority. And so I don't know. I don't know if any testing has been done and the sample has been consumed, used up, and there's nothing left to test. I don't know.
That really helps understand this. And I wanted to run one thing by you too. So back in 2000, I want to say it was 2021, it was reported from a source, Tom Voigt, who runs ZodiacKiller.com website. He had an inside source that said a DNA profile was developed, and we don't know where it was developed from. I'm assuming it's off one of these envelopes or letters or stamps. And the way he explained it, and he didn't, I don't know how much information he was given or how it was explained to him, but the way he explained it to the world, to the rest of us, is the profile that was generated was from someone who could not possibly have been Zodiac. So when you just hear something generic like that, what comes to your mind? Does that mean the person was maybe Hispanic? Does that mean the person was too young? Does that mean the person was female? So they get this profile, but it can't be Zodiac. What do you think that could possibly mean?
Yeah. Well, it could be too young. That would be a possibility if they got a profile and determined who it was. And that's happened in other cases where, they have this matching profile to some horrific crime, and then they look and the person was 3 years old at the time. So, okay, there's some either contamination in the lab or contamination when, handling the evidence or something like that. So that's a possibility. I don't think if you're talking about race, if they use traditional DNA testing, we can't make that determination. So when I look at a DNA profile, I can tell you whether there's male or female DNA present, but that's it. I can't tell you anything about their ethnicity, anything like that. Now, if there was a DNA profile, if there was DNA developed and it was sent to like Parabon Nanolabs, who does both genealogy as well as like identity type testing, then yes, that would be a way if they could say, okay, this person is most likely Hispanic or African American or, whatever. So that would be a possibility, I suppose, if they did that type of testing. I can't imagine, but even if that's the case, I can't imagine someone being ruled out solely on race. I understand that there's some eyewitness testimony and things like that, but I can't imagine someone just saying, oh, no, this person's more likely to be Hispanic. I'm just not going to pursue this lead. That doesn't make sense to me. So another possibility would be the profile ended up matching an investigator or, someone associated with the case where they're like, oh, this is contaminated. And so we have this, database of people who handled the evidence or processed the evidence, collected, some database that they can compare to and say, okay, we got a profile, but unfortunately it's the letter carrier's DNA or, whatever. I don't know who all they've tested as an elimination database. So that would be a possibility. Otherwise, I'm not sure how they can come to the conclusion that it's definitely not the Zodiac.
Yeah. And it is secondhand information that somebody else got that they tried to explain to the rest of the world here. And maybe something's being lost in translation, but that's basically the excuse we got. So it'll be interesting to see if they can go back and find something else. So I want to run through the confirmed crimes, and I want to zip through them pretty quickly because in the interest of your time. So I'm going to just go through the cases one by one, the confirmed cases, just tell you basically what evidence there is. And you just give me a quick opinion on what should be looked at. So you have the first victims, Faraday and Jensen, killed in December 1968. The evidence from that case is really shell casings and bullets that were recovered. What might reveal DNA in that situation?
So are you talking about bullets that have passed through the bodies or that missed the bodies? Okay. So bullets that have passed through the bodies, I don't think, those are really going to be useful because there's going to be so much DNA from the victims themselves that you're not, even if there was a little bit of DNA from the perpetrator, it's going to be overwhelmed by the blood and tissue and whatever from the victims. So I don't think that's useful, but the shell casing certainly could be. Now, of course, I'm sure that these were handled without gloves, right? In 1968, I'm sure that they were probably handled by multiple individuals. So that's going to complicate matters. It may be possible if you had, again, kind of like an elimination database of, okay, we know that this person collected them and then they were handled by the firearms examiner. So, you have this kind of list of DNA profiles from the people that handled the items. They could still be tested. We're having a lot more success with fired casings. There was like a original paper that came out, I don't know, in the 90s or something, or late, maybe it's 2000s. And it was like this small scale study someone did and said, oh no, you're never going to get DNA from fired casings. The temperature is too high. We just didn't get any results. And everyone seemed to take that as like the God's honest truth and never, didn't do much else with it. Just this assumption that, oh, you'll never get DNA from that. And then finally someone did a more, in-depth study and found that actually DNA can survive. And so through the years, we found that, again, with the sensitivity of testing, with different techniques, in our lab, we use a soaking and swabbing method. So instead of just taking a swab and wetting it and swabbing a casing and going forward with that swab, we actually take the whole casing, put it in liquid, extraction liquid, and heat it gently and, agitation to try to loosen. What we're trying to do is loosen any of the cells that might have gotten caught up in the like the head stamp of the casing, for example, or in the grooves there. And then we swab the casing and then combine that swab with the soaking liquid. So by doing that process, we've increased the successfulness or the ability to successfully recover DNA to almost 50%. So that's like, 1 out of 2 casings typically give us at least a partial profile. So with this case and with any case with casings, if you had, you could test them. If you get a profile, you just would need to compare that to anyone who is known to have handled the item. And even if it's a mixture, so maybe the firearms examiner's DNA is on the casing, but maybe there's someone else's DNA there as well that is, can be kind of separated out and pulled out and said, okay, now this is our unknown person's DNA. So that would be a possibility with any of the cases where you have fired casings.
And the next case is Farron and Mageau from July 69. You've got the same thing, casings and bullets, which you just touched on. We have letters and envelopes in that case too, which you talked about previously. It's really in September 1969 with the case of Hartnell and Shepard that there's a little bit of different evidence. You have both clothesline bindings, the plastic clothesline type stuff that were used as bindings by the killer. He had them pre-cut and brought them to the scene with him. He made one of the victims, tie up the other victim with them. And then you also have, he wrote on a car door. So out of the bindings and the car door writing, what might we find? And let me, before you say that, before you get started, let me let you know that the bindings were tested, and this was what I mentioned was tested. I'm guessing close to 10 years ago now.
Okay. Well, I would pretty much guarantee that an MVAC was not used on the clothesline if it was 10 years ago. So it was probably just a swabbing, or maybe even a cutting, probably a swabbing. And, a swab, there's a limit to what, like the swab is not 100% effective at picking up DNA. And then it's not, when you extract it, the extraction is not 100% efficient. So every step you're kind of losing some of that cellular material that may be present. I have had success with MVACing items that have already been swabbed. So it'd be possible to MVAC the bindings and see if we could pick up additional DNA. So I think that would be worth attempting at least. Now the car door writing, is the car door still in evidence, or you don't know?
It is.
It is. Interesting. Did the witnesses say that the perpetrator was wearing gloves?
I believe they said he was wearing gloves. I don't know if he was wearing gloves when he wrote on the car door.
Right. Okay. So if he was not wearing gloves when he wrote on the car door, then I think there's a really good chance you could pick up DNA. Even if he was wearing gloves, it's a lower chance, but it depends on what type of gloves and what all he touched. So even if you're wearing gloves, you might not be leaving fingerprints, but you still have the potential to leave DNA behind because, if these are gloves that he wore regularly and just grab them and put them on, if he is touching his own face or hair or, during the commission of this crime, if he's touching his own body, he's again picking up DNA from himself onto the surface of the gloves and then has the potential to transfer those. So I think either way, whether he was wearing gloves or not, that would definitely be an item worth trying to collect the DNA from. And that kind of goes into, I touched on it briefly, the letters and envelopes. I think in the past, everyone just thought of, let's swab or collect DNA from under the flap or under the envelope where someone has licked the item. But again, those letters, it's going to depend on how many people handled or touched them, of course. But if you take a swab or one or two swabs and swab the entire surface of that letter, you're probably going to be picking up DNA just from someone writing it, someone's hand coming into contact with it, someone folding it. You swab along the creases where someone has put pressure and, pressed down and folded a letter, good chance of getting DNA.
Fascinating. You mentioned, with wearing gloves, you would think that would block DNA from coming out, but then you mentioned if they're touching their face, wiping sweat off their head, that kind of stuff. There's still potential, even with the gloves on, to have left DNA, which is really fascinating. So then we have the next crime. Oh, and real quick before we move on, you mentioned MVAC. You and I know what MVAC is, but for listeners out there that don't know, can you do like a 30-second or 60-second quick abbreviated version of what that is exactly?
Sure thing. Yeah, it's basically a wet vacuum that's made for forensic purposes. So, it sprays down a sterile liquid onto the item you're testing, whether it's, a shirt or a knife or whatever. The liquid is sprayed down onto the surface of this item. And as it hits the item, it basically is loosening any of the cellular material that might be present. And at the same time, it's also vacuuming up that liquid. So it sprays down, loosens cells, and then that liquid is collected into a collection bottle. So now you have this bottle of liquid that hopefully contains, any cellular material. And then we pass that liquid through a filter, a really fine filter, where it's so fine that the cells can't pass through. The liquid passes through, but any of the cells stay on top of the filter. And then that's what we cut that filter out and test it just like any other sample.
Yeah, fascinating. So the final confirmed victim is Paul Stein in October of '69, and I'm thinking this potentially is the case with the most possible physical evidence. He rode in the cab with Stein. The casings of bullets were left. We talked about that already. A couple things that were found there are interesting. First off, a pair of gloves were found in the car that may or may not have belonged to the killer. That's still sort of being debated. A second clue was a fingerprint believed to be from the killer was found in blood on the cab door. And the third evidence is that after the murder, a couple days later, he mailed a shirt piece from the victim that he tore off. So three big pieces of evidence here, potentially.
Okay.
I'm curious what you think about those three pieces of evidence in the Stein case.
Okay. Well, the gloves definitely would be a source of DNA, just collecting from inside the gloves. Certainly you could tell at a minimum if those belong to Stein or not. I assume they would have a reference sample from him. So if you're able to swab on the interior of the gloves, you can either include or exclude Stein. If he is excluded, then it doesn't necessarily mean that those are from the Zodiac and not from another passenger, but at least you have an answer as to whether Stein was included or excluded, whether they were his gloves or not. And then, you would also be able to tell if there's male or female DNA. So if it's female DNA, okay, maybe a passenger left them, but that's probably also something you can tell just by looking at the style or size of the gloves. So yeah, I definitely think that those would be a good source of DNA. You may get a mixture of DNA, but we have better methods at separating out the DNA than we used to. Some different software programs that can help us do that. And then you mentioned the fingerprint in blood. That one's going to be, so if it's a fingerprint in blood from the perpetrator, well, yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic item of evidence, but it's probably more likely that it's the victim's blood. And so there, it's going to be really difficult to get perpetrator DNA because, again, you have this really rich source of DNA from the victim, if that's his blood, and only a small amount of DNA that would be expected to be transferred from the Zodiac. So you might not see that second contributor. Now, if this was a female victim, then you could do YSTR testing, ignore all of the female DNA and just look for the male DNA. But since you have a male victim, that's not going to be possible in that case.
And just to clarify to listeners, because I think this is important, fingerprints themselves can sometimes yield DNA, correct?
Oh yeah, yes, right.
And that's important too, because there are latent and partial prints throughout this case. There's palm prints from letters, so there are several prints that may be Zodiacs in this case.
Right. So one of the things, obviously you want those prints to be preserved and to be able to be searched or compared, but that can be done through, digital photography. And then you're not always going to get a profile. It's going to depend upon how much cellular material is transferred. But, prints are usually collected using tape. So, you put down your black powder, and then you're using this lifting tape to pull the print up off of the surface, and then it's basically retained on, kind of like an index card type of thing. So whatever DNA was present is preserved there, is caught in between the tape and the card. So now we can, pull that apart and swab or collect from the surface and try to pick up any of those skin cells. So yes, that is something that can and have, I've done that in other cases, basically, where that's the only thing that's left is just a few latent prints, or they're not usable prints, but they have still retained them. There might be enough DNA to get a profile from that.
So the third piece of evidence was the ripped and torn shirt. He actually climbed into the front of the seat with the victim, ripped and tore at his shirt, cut it with a knife, whatever. He handled the shirt. Then he later mailed at least 2 pieces of that shirt to the police and to an attorney. So what potential DNA might there be in the pieces of shirt that were mailed and on the shirt that was left on the victim, the remaining shirt that was on him?
So so it's going to depend on if there was blood present or not at that particular location. So again, if you have victim's blood, that's going to tend to mask or cover the smaller amount of DNA left behind from someone just touching the item. But if there are areas that were not bloody, and if the shirt, especially if the shirt was ripped versus cut, I mean, even if it was cut, someone's probably going to hold one portion, hold a portion of the shirt while they're cutting that piece off. But especially if it was ripped, you have to use pressure, and, there's more pressure and friction involved. And those are things that tend to increase the amount of DNA left behind. So what you'd want to do is try to find an area along that ripped edge that did not appear to be bloody. That's going to give you your best chance of getting the perpetrator's DNA. And again, in at least one of those portions of the shirt, we know was handled by other individuals and investigators. So that's something to be aware of, just when you're trying to interpret the DNA results.
And one last thing about the cab. So, this is something that I had a debate with somebody online. They suggested, why not MVAC the entire cab and just sift through every bit of DNA you get? I think I know the answer to that, but I'm curious, can you give an explanation of why that would be, a monumental task probably and hard to do?
Yeah, it's because even if this weren't a public vehicle or, something that a lot of people were sitting in, MVACing is going to pick up any of the DNA that's present. So you have a cab where you have multiple people at multiple times a day in and out of this vehicle, and they all have the potential of leaving their DNA behind. So I think that what you would end up with is a mixture of DNA that is so complex with so many individuals that there's literally nothing you can do with. So I don't think that would be a good method. If they knew where, like which seat the Zodiac was sitting in, you could maybe try to focus just on that particular area. I mean, like I have MVAC'd a car seat cover in the past and picked up some DNA consistent with someone who's riding in the vehicle. So I guess my point is, if you were like able to pinpoint more specific areas, I just think that would be pretty tough, because I do think that you get so much of a mixture you couldn't do too much with.
I wanted to touch on some of these possible cases, especially the ones you worked on. So going back to April 1962, Oceanside, Ray Davis, obviously you have some of the evidence we talked about, casings, bullets, letters, envelopes, that kind of stuff. What was your role in the Davis case, and what were your opinions that you came to, or conclusions that you came to in that case?
So I did some MVAC collection. on some items. I did not do the DNA testing. I wanted to. I tried really hard to get the evidence sent to our lab. But there was a grant, like kind of a case-by-case grant that was being used to fund this testing. And they funded the AbJack collection, but not the DNA testing. So the investigators are using their local laboratory, which would be the San Diego Sheriff's Office. And the last I heard from the investigator is that they're still just waiting for results. They haven't been tested yet. And that's probably been a couple of years. So this is one of those cold case things, right? Where it goes and, San Diego is a big city, a large area. They have a lot of cases that they have to work that are coming in currently. And so they have not been able to work those back. I don't really want to get into the specific items because I'm not sure what all I can, release, but we have some hope that these items may have been contacted by the perpetrator, whether that's Zodiac or someone else. We think, that the person who did this would have had to, the person who did this would have had to come into contact with Ray with the items that were tested. So we're hoping to pick up that person's DNA.
Interesting. And then another case you worked on was Sherry Jo Bates, October 1966, Riverside. Now, this one was another one. It seemed like there was a good amount of potential evidence there. There were cigarette butts that were collected at the scene that may or may not have been from the killer. There was a chunk of flesh, like a clot of, skin under, in Sherry's hand. In that case, you actually did some work on her pants, if I remember correctly. What was your role in Sherry's case, and what did you find? What conclusions did you come to?
So, two things with this case. One is, I did AbJack collection on the pants. Also took a couple of cuttings from blood stains that seemed a little different in terms of they look like possible drips. Like if the perpetrator had cut himself and was bleeding, standing upright, and then that dripped down and made a nice, perfect circle instead of like a smear or something like that. And then there was also a men's watch that I had already been tested, but we took it apart, back the band. I did not do the DNA testing. That was done by a different laboratory. They were able to get some results, but it was from the watch. I don't think they got much of anything from the watch. The pants, the mixture, low level mixture. I don't think we even had a reference sample, or they had a reference sample from Sherry herself to figure out what portion of the DNA is being contributed by her. And one of the reasons we didn't have a reference sample is that the prior lab, the Riverside lab, had tried to use one of the blood stains. There were a lot of staining on the pants, and they tried to use one of those stains as a reference sample for Sherry. So they're assuming, okay, she's the one that's doing most of the bleeding, so let's get her DNA from one of these blood stains. They were not able to get a profile from the blood stain. So that tells you how degraded these samples were. So my understanding is they were not stored in a heat controlled environment. And so the DNA is virtually all degraded from her case. I will say that, to Riverside's credit, they are still working on this case. They're still looking into the evidence. We have some of the evidence at our lab right now. So, it's something that is still, it's not something that they've forgotten about or given up on. So I think that, we're going to keep trying. I just don't think that the evidence was stored in the best. And I'm not saying this is, to say anything negative about Riverside. It's just, this is in 1966. Like where
They didn't know any
you have
better.
how many
Yeah,
cases?
yeah.
Exactly. And you run out of storage room. You got to move it to an offsite storage facility. And if that offsite storage facility isn't temperature controlled, or, then you're exposing the evidence to heat and humidity and things like that. It's going to break down over time.
Yeah. And there were two other pieces, and one you mentioned, one I actually forgot about, was the watch that was found at the scene that presumably could have come from the killer. Did you examine the watch at all?
I did, yes. Yeah.
And find anything interesting there?
I mean, it had already been through, you could tell, like, because of markings on the watch, that multiple laboratories had looked at this watch before. Our thought was perhaps DNA from the perpetrator has kind of sunk through the band, because my recollection was a leather band, and would be more like protected or less contaminated from sort of the interior of the band. So I split the band open. I sliced it open with a scalpel and tried to collect from the inside of the band. I think I did the outside of the band as well. But again, that was sent to a different laboratory for testing. This was back in, 2016, 17. The lab that I work at, I was not working at Purgo Forensics at the time, or we would have done it ourselves. But again, this is an item that you have a couple things going on. Number one, it's old. Number two, it probably hasn't been stored properly. And number three, it's leather, which is a known inhibitor of the DNA analysis process or the copying process. So it was a tough sample to work with. And I don't think the lab was able to get either they got a few DNA types here and there, or they got nothing at all. I can't remember right now, but nothing that was comparable.
And which is a shame, because you think a watch would potentially be a nice collecting thing for DNA. And one other case I want to ask you about, and this was one that before we move on, I just want to ask you about the clotted hair in Sherry's hand. Did you examine that at all?
I did not. No, I don't. Yeah, I don't. I don't think. I'm not aware of that sample. We'll just put it that way. I'm not working, and to be honest, I'm not working on the additional evidence from that a colleague of mine is doing any of the additional testing. I don't recollect that sample. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I don't recall it right now.
Sure. And potentially, though, a clotted hair with a skin at the base of it could potentially be a good clue to work with, though, from a DNA standpoint.
Absolutely. And you can be sure that, if there are hairs remaining, then we would definitely, we would take a look at them to see if there's any root material present, because if there's a root and the root is in the proper stage of growth, that's meaning there's living, or there's cellular material present, then it's always best to try to do regular STR, the normal DNA testing, because then you can do a direct comparison to any of your suspects. If there isn't, we would certainly recommend Astria. So, we're going to do whatever is best for the evidence. So, at least rest assured that the team, if this exists and we have it, the items will be properly processed or sent to a laboratory that, if we can't do it ourselves, we're going to send it to a lab that's going to be able to get the best, have the highest chances of getting the best results.
And then the last case I want to ask you about is one you didn't work on, which is Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards. They were killed in Santa Barbara County in June 1963. They were shot. So we've talked about casings, bullets being, found. Pre-cut lengths of rope were found, sort of like in the other case we mentioned. But a couple of different things that were different here is the female victim's bathing suit was cut with a knife, so possibly the killer handled her bathing suit. There were wooden matches used to start a fire, and then also their bodies were dragged to a shack. So there's few clues there what might be found in regards to those things.
Okay. Yeah, the lengths of rope. So that's interesting, because they had that was previous. The clothesline in the other case. So yeah, the rope I would want to MVAC that and might have a better chance of getting results than the plastic clothesline, just because DNA is going to adhere a little bit better, be retained a little bit better on like a fiber or cloth type of rope versus plastic. And so I think, that you could focus on the areas that had been cut and either swab, or I would prefer obviously MVACing those cut areas. And then the bathing suit, I mean, if it was cut with a knife, I mean, there would be a possibility the perpetrator's hand would come into contact with the bathing suit. So that might be a possibility. That probably wouldn't be my primary area to test. The wooden matches, sure, you might be able to get something from that. But it's a smaller item. So, you have to think about the surface area, or how much contact would it be possible? Sure, it'd be possible. And then the body's being carried to the shack. So that's interesting. So that's definitely something that any of the clothing items, now it sounds like if they're on the beach, maybe Domingo's, I don't know if he had a shirt on or not. But if he did, then focus on like the underarm area, or if they had pants on, then that's going to depend on whether were they dragged by their feet or were they dragged under their arms. So, if a determination can be made based upon drag marks in the sand or something like that, then you have an idea of what areas to focus on, right? So you can say, okay, I'm gonna MVAC under the arms, or I'm gonna MVAC, if they had socks or shoes or pants or anything that someone would have come into contact with, then those are great areas to MVAC and try to pick up that perpetrator's DNA.
So that's it for a run through on the victims. I want, as we wrap up, I want to just ask you. So if Susanna Ryan is given full carte blanche, you get access to every bit of evidence in every case we discussed here today, and resources, funds are not an option. You can do whatever you want. What are you doing to try and solve this case?
Goodness. I mean, obviously I would need access to figure out like what was tested and what wasn't. It seems like there's an awful lot of letters and communication in this case that I'm not sure we're fully tested, or, we're again talking about maybe the stamps and flaps were, but what about the rest of the letter? So I think any of those letters could be sampled or resampled. I think any of the hairs, if they still exist, let's do send those for SNP testing. There seems to be a lot of casings again to work with. So I do think that there's a lot of evidence in this case, just because there's so many different cases. Now, you're going to have to be aware of contamination and things like that. But if you start testing a lot of these items of evidence and you start seeing the same person's profile on multiple pieces of evidence, especially if they're from different jurisdictions, so that the same investigators didn't come into contact with these same items, then it starts to paint a picture of, who is the real, what DNA is the real Zodiac's DNA, right? So, it's such an old case. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a case that is a slam dunk, but I do think that there's definitely items of evidence that probably have not been looked at or haven't been looked at in a long time, and deserve a second chance to, kind of look at these items and do the testing and try to put this together, because my goodness, there's so many families and people involved, and how many investigative hours have been spent on this case that it would make sense at this point to get the funding or take the funding and just test everything that's left and go forward with it today. And we have such advancements today that I think that either through traditional testing or really through genetic genealogy, you have a better chance of finding Zodiac.
Yeah, and we see cases being solved every week. It seems like there's a news story. The cases are getting older and older, 30, 40 years old in some cases.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then, so one thing, obviously, I gave you the scenario. If you were handed all this evidence and they said, go solve these cases and funds weren't a problem, spend as much as it takes.
Mhm.
Obviously that hasn't happened, but, one thing people, talk about is this not happening or not happening faster because funds are an issue? I know people like yourself are sometimes willing to help with donating time or discounting cost, anything to make it easier for these agencies. Can you just talk a little bit about that and what someone like yourself can do to help these agencies out that might be in a not the best financial situation or whatever?
Mhm. Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're always willing to discount cases, especially when you have multiple items of evidence. So that's something that, we're definitely willing at our laboratory to do, to say, okay, if you're going to send me 10, 20 items, then yeah, I can definitely give you a discount on each of those items. I think also that, with crowdsourcing, crowdfunding type of stuff, or there are some, I mentioned the Ray Davis case that was through a grant. There's an agency or a organization called Season of Justice that they're the ones that provided the funding for some of that initial testing. So I think that there are ways out there to obtain the funding to do the testing. It just, there has to be someone, in charge or that has access to the evidence that's willing to release that evidence, to get it together and say, okay, this is what we want done, and look for funding. There, again, creative ways of finding funding. There's some agencies that will fund cases through like money and things seized through drug cases. They use those funds for outside DNA testing. There are federal grants available. So there are ways to get it done. You just have to have the person that is in charge of making those decisions that wants to move forward with it.
Well, that's promising. So it shouldn't be a hurdle as far as funding and people like yourself that can do this work. So SFPD, if you're listening, call Susanna up.
Right.
She's got a website. There's no real excuse not to do this. And, I think it's just frustrating that we're not seeing more because there are so many communications. There are multiple victims in multiple jurisdictions that it's just a case that a lot of us hope to see solved. And
sure,
it just seems like it's going agonizingly slow. So to close out here, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot. You've got a lot of money to bet on this case being solved or not solved. Are you betting it's going to be solved or it's not going to be solved?
Oh, that's tough.
Don't give me bad news.
I'm going to say I am betting that with all the evidence in this case, all those letters and communications, all the victims, different evidence collected from the different crime scenes, I think, it's a little bit of a needle in a haystack, but I think it can be solved. So, I do think that you have, with the advancements we have today in DNA testing, and I think we can get a profile and at least get something. I think that it's going to be a genealogy case, frankly. I don't, we get a profile today. I don't think it's going to match somebody in CODIS. I think if we get a profile, we can include or exclude suspects from it. But if everyone's excluded, frankly, I think that it's going to be a forensic genealogy case where we get enough DNA from one of those stamps or envelopes or something, and then that's submitted and searched in the databases. I think that's the way it's going to be solved.
That's where I'm putting my money. And just so one more time, where can people find you? If there's anybody out there that needs your services, how do they go about getting a hold of you?
You can reach me through my consulting company, which is Ryan Forensic DNA Consulting. And I have a website there, ryanforensicdna.com. Or if you want DNA testing done, then you can reach out to myself or my colleagues at Pure Gold Forensics. And we have a website there, puregoldforensics.com, and all of our contact information is on there. So you can email or call, and we'd be happy to help you out.
Well, thank you so much, Susanna. This was a wealth of information, and I appreciate taking the time to come on and discuss the case.
Sure thing. Yeah, no problem.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.